What do Sydney Sweeney, Cracker Barrel, and George Floyd all have in common? These are all objects of our country's endless hysterics about race. But what if race isn't real? What if race is just a fiction and we're all getting amped up by a lie? That's the core point of Thomas Chatterton Williams.
I have a kind of racial abolitionist point of view where I believe the whole thing's an illusion.
Thomas wrote the single best book on the madness of 2020, a summer during which activists, under the guise of racial justice, were left free to loot and burn and tear down, while actively encouraged by all the organs of elite opinion. Thomas now writes for those exact same organizations. It's an odd perch. Where does this activist energy to tear down come from?
Would have to try to grapple with what is the kind of existential dimension of wokeness and the kind of lack of meaning.
How is the summer of 2020 tied to the failure of Barack Obama to live up to the hype?
He lost some of the kind of goodwill that he came into office with.
And if race isn't real, how can he still celebrate the very clear reality of black cool?
So when I talk about, the kind of black cool or something like that, it's nothing in the blood or the skin. It's about, a tradition of people that came and forged themselves under certain circumstances.
You wrote in an earlier book that the definitive moment in your life that was kind of the earthquake moment where you really began to move towards this more race abolitionist approach was the birth of your eldest daughter. Can you explain how that worked?
Well, my daughter was born in 2013. And, prior to that, I had a long kind of, trajectory of going from, mom is white, dad is black. I'm 44 years old, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s. You couldn't even select more than one box on the census in America until the year 2000. I didn't even grow up thinking of myself as biracial. I had a white mom, but I was black. And the white kids I was growing up around didn't think I was white. And the black kids I was growing up around were accustomed to having, all manner of skin tones in the black community and didn't think it was weird to have mixed kids in the black community. So it was pretty cut and dried for me, my racial identity. Didn't think about it very much until I realized that the mother of my children was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and I realized my mom is blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and it started to strike me that my kids might be blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and what would that actually mean? And I'm living in Paris, and I'm interacting with, people who don't necessarily actually think about things in terms of the one-drop rule. That's actually living outside of America.
Talk about this.
Yeah,
it's a very American phenomenon.
It's a very American phenomenon, and I think in America you don't even it's just atmospheric, so you don't even question that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily think that.
That's actually cultural programming that's very specific to this country.
Yeah, and so French people I would say something just from my American point of view about how my kids would be black, and French people would be like, why? What? They'd have black ancestry, but why would they be black? Why wouldn't they also be? And what if they look mostly not black? And what does that mean? And so I wrote this op-ed in the New York Times a year before she was born, arguing that mixed race black people have a moral duty to identify as black. And I realized even as I was writing it, that I was really writing that op-ed for an audience of one. I was writing that for myself to convince myself, because I was already starting to sense that the kind of grip of the racial logic was losing its hold on me. I would be explaining to people in Paris, the idea of the one-drop rule, and I would just hear myself echoing the kind of the logic of the plantation and of the slave owner, and I was making the case that actually was a kind of argument that whiteness is a category of purity, and that actually started to strike me as insane. And by the time that my daughter was born, and I held her in my arms, I didn't think to myself, here it is, I have a white daughter, and here it is, my daughter's a different race than me. I realized that the fiction of race no longer held a spell over me, and I couldn't see her in these categories I was taught to see myself in, and the whole thing just fell apart for me. And I realized that we live on the racial margins. Most people don't actually have such like mixedness in their families, but I began to suspect that like these categories don't say something very true about us, but they probably don't say something very true about anybody really if we think about it. And that was when I began to really realize that I can't send this kid into the world, with the logic of the plantation insisting that she's black because a drop of black blood makes a person black. And I can't send her into the world saying that she's white. She has a complicated ancestry, as we all do. And she's both an individual and her race is Homo sapiens. And that's the fact of it. She has a specific kind of ethnicity and cultural background, and she has, her racial identity is human. And, people laugh in your face if you say things like this. They think you're the most naive person they've ever heard in your life. But the more I thought about it, and as I was writing my book about this, Self-Portrait in Black and White, it really struck me that, race, as we think about it, as these kind of color categories, it's old, but it's not that old. It's half a millennia old. It's a real Enlightenment phenomenon.
Right.
Anything that comes into being that's like an idea that humans create is also something that could also not be in circulation. We could change.
It's artifice, yeah.
Yeah. And so we do race because we all agree to do race. And so I just said to myself there and then that, people might continue to do race until the sun burns out. But, I won't be forced to be a participant in what my late great friend Stanley Crouch called the all-American skin game. I'm out. I'm retiring from that. I'm not using the language that I think reinscribes these disastrous ideas. I'm not participating in it, and I'm not raising my kids to believe in and invest in racial identity, even if they're not fully in control of how the world sees them. Because your racial identity is ultimately a negotiation. I'm aware of that. You define yourself, and then the world also interacts with you, and it also asserts its own definition of who you are. I can't just go out and say I'm Japanese, but I will push back and not allow myself to be. I won't have to participate in calling myself what the slave owner used to call my ancestors. I'm just out of that. And one of the things that really struck me living in France was that, and especially when I used to shave my head, and my physical characteristics looked in France to people like someone who was Arab or from North Africa.
Yeah.
And so I would often, identity as a negotiation, you define yourself, but it's also how society perceives you. But I would be perceived and even profiled and stopped and bothered in airports at the height of the war on terror because I was being racialized as an Arab. But it doesn't make me Arab. And the fundamental insight I had of that is like, even if people always say, well, you're post-racial until a cop, profiles you. And it's like a cop profiling me and telling me that I'm an N-word or whatever doesn't make me that any more than a cop profiling me and telling me I'm Arab, because these are just categories of seeing, and they're illusions of seeing, and they're guided by racial prejudice to begin with.
At the same time, you've also written very eloquently about what I think even your own terminology is about certain glories of black culture, straight up. You wrote a great piece about P. Diddy right after his maybe conviction or after the verdict, right?
After the verdict, yeah.
I'll let you describe what it is, but a lot of it was that he embodied and displayed a certain kind of compelling hybrid of, traditional low rap culture, but there was like a business corporate sheen to it as well, right? And it's has a very distinctive racial element to it, particularly in the 90s. I just watched Netflix has a long series about the late 90s Dallas Cowboys.
I need to watch that.
It's excellent. I had no idea Michael Irvin was put on trial for cocaine, possession.
Mm-hmm.
And on like the second to last day of the trial, part of the way that he prepares is he goes into this Austin, Texas courthouse. It's 95 degrees, and he's wearing a full mink coat and sunglasses, right? And it's like very definitively, powerfully, charismatically late 90s Black culture of the kind that you describe in that piece, right?
Yeah.
There has to be, I don't know what it is. I can't articulate it. I'm not even sure if it exists, but it feels like it's there. Some sort of tension between, on one hand, wanting to celebrate that and be like, that's incredible, and was enormously influential over a lot of chubby white private school kids like me, right? Who worship that shit, right? You grow up in the 90s, who are like 3 of your top 5 humans in the world.
Michael Jordan.
Like, don't insult me. Kobe, Eddie Murphy, and Biggie, right? It's like 3. I mean, back then, it's like it's like no joke to say this is like your vision of human excellence, and you don't necessarily racialize it when you're 14, at least not consciously. There is that phenomena. At the same time, you have this kind of racial abolitionist angle, which says even that category of Black culture itself might just be a pure fiction, and there seems to be a tension there. There seems to be. I don't know.
Well, no. Well, I just, I think that it's important to use language more precisely than we're accustomed to, and that the way that like racecraft gets propagated is through kind of the slippage between using like racial terms to talk about culture and things like that, and to talk about biology and things like that, and to slip back and to toggle between the two senses. So I really find myself, with a ton of affinity for and loyalty to like a community and a tradition, a way of shaking hands or a way of dressing, a way of making music, a way of laughing, that to me you can call Black. But it really, what it refers to is a specific community of people in a specific geography over a specific period of time. It's different here than it is in other parts of the world. One of my favorite writers of any ethnicity or background is James Baldwin. And, one of the things that he really wrote so eloquently about was the feeling of being in Paris, coming from Harlem.
Wow.
Escaping, the kind of racial caste system that he was, subject to in America, pre-civil rights, arriving in Paris and realizing, damn, I have more in common with a white Texas GI than I do with a Senegalese man here, and he has more in common with me than he does with a white Frenchman. We know it. Everybody knows it. There's something between us. We're from a specific place, And so the idea that there's a kind of essential Blackness that makes a Jamaican, a Senegalese person, and a guy from Harlem the same, just like there's some type of essential whiteness somehow that makes an Englishman, an Italian, and an Albanian the same is ridiculous. So when I talk about the kind of Black cool or something like that, it's nothing in the blood or the skin. It's about a tradition of people that like came and forged themselves under certain circumstances, under certain they overcame certain hardships. They won themselves.
Right.
And what Ralph Ellison always pointed out that I find so fascinating and so true is that African Americans fundamentally imagined themselves into being in part based on Old Testament Jews. Through the Gospels and the kind of singing that happened when we were enslaved, and they imagined themselves into the kind of Exodus, and that's part of what it means to be Black American. So everything is a kind of very interesting cultural exchange and mix, and so that kind of Black cool that you're talking about, and that I thought Puffy really had in the 90s, and that of course Michael Irvin had, or Michael Jordan, for me that was like the definitive figure growing up. That really is signifying something. That really is recognizable, and people participate in that. That type of Black culture is an achievement. I think it's one of America's great innovations. That's a real form of modernism, of modernity, being a modern human being. But it's not. What I had to learn, and what I believe, is that it's not biological. And we do ourselves all a disservice when we reify these ideas of racial difference as existing in the body and having a biological reality.
Is the idea to try to be precise with it that that particular cultural pocket happens to have a somewhat like homogenous racial component, but that's because if you're particularly talking about the African American experience, right? That pocket had a shared social experience because of specific human institutions of law that themselves were explicitly designed to categorize by race.
That's
Does
right.
that make sense?
It does make total sense, but it's always vague. Even if most people physically resembled what we think of as black, from the beginning, there were always people who could look like you and could still be categorized as black and enslaved. And we have, there have always been white Negroes. There have always been what used to be called octoroons and quadroons. There have always been people who were descended from the slave master who were enslaved as black.
Didn't you say that, is it in your book that the very first miscegenation law was that if a white woman got pregnant with a black child, she could be enslaved?
Oh, that's
Did I remember that right?
Well, it's interesting. In the colonies before the nation was founded, there were all kinds of different ways of doing this, and it used to be that the racial identity of the child was derived from the father, but that actually complicates inheritances, especially when you're having mistresses.
Yeah.
So then it was changed, and the racial identity of the child was bound to the mother. So that actually became kind of convenient too, because you could both have your illegitimate children who wouldn't inherit your property, and you could actually increase your capital by growing your own labor force. It was terrible. I mean, really sick stuff. Yeah.
It's a good deal for the man, I guess.
If you like enslaving your children, I guess it's a good. It's really dark to even contemplate, but yeah.
Okay, so your new book is basically, and I'm not overstating it, the single best piece of like self-contained journalism on what happened in the summer of 2020, right? In terms of our nation's racial reckoning. I think it is.
Thank you.
And it is balanced and incisive in a way that something from, let's say, a more hyper-partisan writer from the right would not be able to strike. Let me ask you a very specific question tied into the fact that our company is based in Richmond, all right? So I'm a Southern California kid, right? I go to school on the East Coast. I end up in Richmond. When I was there, had always thought that Monument Avenue in Richmond, which has a series of monuments to Confederate generals and the Confederate president, was extremely strange and surreal. That we have formal ways of lionizing like great traitors in American history, right? I want you specifically what you make of this. Traitors in history. Those all got torn down that summer. They got torn down, except for the Robert E. Lee one because it was too heavy. Because if the activists had tried to do it themselves, they would have smushed themselves. So they did have to bring a crane in the middle of the night a couple days later to get rid of it, right? That process by which those strange, surreal, potentially anti-American monuments was removed there's something gross about it. At the same time, what they were, but the thing that they were removing itself was like kind of odious. Specifically the general principle I want to ask you about as it relates to 2020 activism more generally. What exactly is this balance between fighting a certain hyper-leftist passion or inclination to just tear down all of history, erase it in like a maximally Orwellian style, versus the actual push towards a more generally racially inclusive, although that's a very, I know, like tough word to use, but like continuing the American progress of a more inclusive country, which probably shouldn't include gigantic monuments to Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. You see what that balance is between those two? How do you think about that, particularly as it relates to this time period that you provide a really powerful anthropological portrait of in your book?
Well, I'm pretty skeptical in general about the idea that you make political disagreements resolved in the streets. I think that, it's scandalous to have monuments to traitors. So I think there's no place for, memorialization of Confederate generals and leaders and politicians. That's ridiculous. I think that should be resolved not in the streets. I think it sets a kind of precedent that you cannot necessarily anticipate where it leads. I don't think rioting and looting, when you believe your cause is right, is the wise route, because then, the tables turn, and when your opponents believe their cause is right, they do the same thing. I think that, we should be able to make the case that we should remove, Confederate monuments. So that's one thing. But more generally, one point that I did think Trump made that actually, if you think about it, forget who the messenger is, but you think about what he was actually saying, I think it really was true, was that, where does this end? What's the limit? Like, if we're going back in history and we're poring over all of the kind of sins and evils that our founding fathers and, people that we do commemorate and remember for some good that they did, if we pore over their lives and look at what bad they did, you're going to find a lot of bad things too. And, Washington was a big slave owner. Jefferson was a big slave owner. So he posed the question, like, well, are we going to take down statues of George Washington? Because, by this logic, that might be where we end up going. And so I think, of course, we're not going to take down statues of George Washington. We shouldn't. And that should, and we should actually, to your point, we should look for ways to be more inclusive and to build more statues, while being aware of the kind of, the ambiguity of, the morality of even our greatest heroes and our founding fathers, right?
The right way to look at it is that everybody in America's past was a simple, confused primate like the rest of us. But that actually makes their accomplishment all the more incredible. I think is so. The way to think about it, right?
I think so. And I think, if you go back and you have a kind of level of moral purity that you demand, there's not going to be many statues remaining. Yeah.
Let me ask this in sort of an orthogonal way. So you have a new book about the summer of 2020 where you do an excellent job of cataloging and describing how there was a lot of chaos and damage and violence that was enabled, particularly by elite institutions under the banner of racial justice, right? I think it's a pretty definitive portrait of what happened there. Has there been anyone that's of any prominence that's engaged with your text in a way that isn't instantly intellectually dishonest, right? So that means you can't mention the New York Times. Do you feel like there's been anyone on this book tour or on this release? It can't just be a random Twitter bot, but anybody who's come to you with some sort of critique of your essential portrait of what happened then that you're like, I think they might be onto something.
Oh, you mean somebody who disagrees,
yeah,
but did it in a way that wasn't like this kind of ad hominem hatchet job?
Yeah, what about Trump?
Yeah, that is, Well, I think this guy, Oliver Traldi, wrote a pretty positive review of the book in National Review, but he did have, some reservations and some criticisms that I thought were pretty interesting. One thing that he said was that, a book that really tries to make sense of what happened, and he's got a philosophy background, a book that tries to make sense of what happened and really would be at the level of the definitive portrait of what we experienced would have to try to grapple with what is the kind of existential dimension of wokeness and the kind of lack of meaning, and the kind of spiritual vacancy or vacuity of this era. And, I tried to get at that in the kind of religious aspect of the cult of anti-racism and all that was, gripping the nation. But I do think that it would be a different book, but I would have, if I had more time, or if I, if I were in a different frame of mind, or you could write this book from a more philosophically inclined angle, and maybe you could spend less time like recounting events and try to get at the kind of the deeper themes of what is it actually that's missing in our modern lives that drives people to, use politics and use kind of political posturing and, pretenses of moral clarity in the ways that they've been used to try to, construct a meaning. And in some ways that would make you have to be more sympathetic and less judgmental, because it really is a kind of a crisis of modern life that leads to some of these problems on both the left and the right. So I found that very intriguing as a way of approaching the book, while he also granted that, there was much to, it was mostly a positive review. So maybe that was why I was able to take the criticism, on the philosophical level.
And the idea you're saying is there's an underlying spiritual pain that would drive people to the cult of anti-racism, an underlying spiritual pain that, it's like you kill off God, you kill off traditional religion, and people have TikTok and DoorDashed mozzarella sticks. And at the end of the day, there is a deep sense of spiritual dissatisfaction with the bargain of modernity. And so the idea is like there's a hole there, and that's what would drive people towards this. But that hole itself is interesting and affects virtually anybody.
I think
lot
so.
Of people.
Yeah, I think that hole is there for people in the cult of MAGA as well, clearly. And, there's such economic dimensions. I think that part of the crisis of meaning, and I try to gesture at this in the book, but 2008 and the kind of, the economic crash that spawned, Occupy Wall Street, that kind of shaped a generation, I think, in deeper ways than we typically speak about. I think that 2008 and Occupy are so important, even though the kind of the tendencies that came out of that expressed themselves in different and more surprising ways as time went on.
Right. Speaking of 2008, you have written somewhat critically about the ways in which Obama specifically seemed to fail to make good on his promise to really accelerate us towards a post-racial America. What's your critique?
Well, I'm pretty sympathetic to him. I'm not sure that anybody could have by themselves been up to such a task, but he did really capture the nation's imagination during his ascent with this idea that we have a flawed history. We have a history of real racial antagonism and pain, but we, or enough of us, would like to move beyond that and weave together the fabric of this multi-ethnic society where we don't forget the past, but we're not bound by it, and we have the freedom to create a future that really would be egalitarian and post-racial in a way that people laugh at you if you use that term, but in the best possible sense of that term, we are beyond the kind of superficial skin deep divisions that have dominated our history and caused so much pain. He made a lot of us believe in that. I was in my 20s and I was completely enthralled by the promise that he represented. And I think oftentimes he did live up to it. He had soaring rhetoric that really, it wasn't just in America. The man went as a candidate to Berlin and had a crowd of 200,000 people. I was in Europe at the time. Europeans were absolutely captivated by the idea that America represents something that they don't see in their own societies, a yearning to be better and transcend. But then, as time wore on, he was immediately faced with a kind of backlash that might suggest that even many Americans who wanted the idea of a black president in a post-racial future didn't like it in practice, didn't like it in fact, and couldn't even always articulate what it was that they didn't like, but they formed the Tea Party movement and all this stuff, and they said it was economic angst. But certainly there was some aspect of resistance that he was dealing with. Also, I think that there was a disillusionment when, the kind of post-racial future that people had been inspired by didn't happen overnight. And so at this time that we started to have the technological component of camera-equipped smartphones and the means of distributing, video through social networks that connected us all, every time somebody who was black and got killed, and it was recorded, that spread in a way that I believe also captured the imagination and made it seem like progress was a hoax, and that nothing was changing, and people became disillusioned. And there were times when I think Obama really was that figure that we had all hoped for. But there were a couple of times that I read about in the book. There were two in particular where I think, in retrospect, he spoke in ways that reinscribed the kind of identity divisions that betrayed the kind of post-racial narrative that he had come into office with. So the first was when my friend and one of my favorite public intellectuals, Henry Louis Gates Jr., was arrested on his own front porch. I don't think it was really, in retrospect, appropriate for Barack Obama to really opine on that, especially not from a racialized angle. I think that for many people in the country, the whole point of saying, yes, we're with you, we want to buy into this kind of vision you're showing us of a post-racial America, was then that we would let the kind of processes take place that, if the police acted in a stupid way or whatever, that would be handled, but the president wouldn't actually have to get involved and speak from a position of kind of racial affinity. It would be not the place of the president to take that kind of, to inject what people saw as identity politics into the matter. The second time was with Trayvon Martin, when Barack Obama spoke about, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. On a human level, that really moved me. On a political level, I thought that was also a mistake. And you can really see how it would be divisive if, in more recent years, Laken Riley was a young white girl who was killed in Georgia by a undocumented immigrant. And you can imagine how inflammatory it would be if Donald Trump said, that could have been my daughter. We would immediately see how that brought an element of kind of whiteness into it. But from another angle, when Obama, we were all outraged that a teenager was stalked and killed by a vigilante playing cop in Sanford, Florida, and there was a unified kind of outrage that didn't have to be reduced to whether or not he looked like the president. And I think that in some ways, Obama never quite recovered after those two kind of interjections. He lost some of the kind of goodwill that he came into office with. And, you can ask the question, and I think it's a valid question to ask, could he have ever kept that goodwill? Or was he bound to have lost it because, in fact, the country just wasn't really ready for the kind of post-racialism that some of us gestured at? I don't know. But I do know that, I do know that there were ways in which I think he could have, there's a different kind of universe in which that reality, we kept faith with that kind of post-racial vision better than we did in the universe that we live in now.
What do you make of a deeper critique of him, that he is still primarily a product of Chicago-style politics, and that he'd gone to Chicago specifically for the purpose of, I'm not saying I believe any of this, I'm just putting it out there for you. He had this very interesting, kind of functionally post-racial childhood in Hawaii, comes to Chicago in order to familiarize himself with a particular kind of political machine. As part of that, he joins Reverend Wright's church, which ends up getting him in a huge amount of trouble when he runs for president. And that there is the rhetorical side of Obama, that it spoke of post-racial America, but the actual proving grounds in which he came up were one in which it's very cynical and strategic racial politics, if you're talking about 90s Chicago political activism. And that it might still be an open question as to how much deep down in his true inner convictions he actually was committed to a lot of the rhetoric that he spoke, and how much of that was potentially a little bit of cynical political posturing. What do you think of that?
Well, he's a fascinating figure because in many ways, I particularly think that everybody performs race because, I have a kind of racial abolitionist point of view where I believe the whole thing's an illusion and it's a meaningless kind of concept in fiction. But Barack Obama specifically performs race in a way that is more interesting than most Americans. I mean, he really didn't have a Black American experience. First of all, he's not descended from African slaves. He's not. His father was an immigrant much more recently than most Black Americans, and he was raised by his white family in some of the least African American corners of the country,
All right.
and also abroad. So it's kind of he imagined himself into this very convincing African American tradition and culture, and he married into it. It's really by proximity to Michelle Obama and her family and the community that was chosen by him to live in Chicago that he participated in what looks to us as Black American culture, but that was all volitional. That was all constructed in a way, and so. In a way, I think that even strengthens his credentials as a truly kind of post-racial figure. He can code switch and move in and out, but who the actual person is a very complex amalgam of different things and different inputs. And, he has a very fascinating perspective. And so I think he was able to speak, at the highest level of oratorical ability and rhetorical ability to different communities in different ways. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a writer that I often disagree with, but he's always interesting to think about and to think with. And, I think he was very astute when he pointed out that the reason why Obama was able to succeed where other Black politicians never had before was because he was fundamentally comfortable around white people. He was raised by white people. And I can understand that from my own upbringing because, my mom is white. My father's a descendant of African slaves. My father's a Black man who grew up in segregated Texas. But you really can't have a kind of wholly oppositional relation to white people if one of the two closest people in your life is white and has nurtured you and loved you. You can never fully be ill at ease, I think, in a way that you can if your entire experience has been one of interacting with racism. And that was actually like the experience of my father growing up, or, that can be a kind of experience. And so Obama didn't have that experience. And Coates' point was that was an atypical kind of, especially in his generation, that was an atypical kind of Black American experience. And it actually gave him a unique advantage in American politics.
What do you think about what happened to Kanye? I need a little bit of preliminary stuff.
Which time?
A little bit of preliminary, and then I want you just to tell me what you think, right? Which is, so our channel got launched in November of 2020 with a video in which Camille told me not to make, which was explicitly a defense of Kanye's decision to run for president.
I wasn't expecting that.
That video still bangs. I stand behind it for what it was at the time. We made certain prognostications about how Kanye would continue to evolve that turned out to be inaccurate. All right. The idea is Kanye shifts from George Bush doesn't care about black people viral moment to MAGA hat, right?
To Heil Hitler.
Okay, we'll get there one step at a time. One step at a time, Thomas. Let's ease on into essentially. I'm going to ask for your take. You got to know where I'm coming from with this, right? To MAGA hat. The way that Kanye talks, 97% of the time, it seems like a series of non sequiturs that don't lead up to rational thought. 3% of the time, and you can see this in the Joe Rogan interview that he did when he ran for president, he'll snap in. The fact that he's a super smart person will snap in, and he'll just say something very clear and very precise and often very what he would call like simulation breaking in terms of what opinions he's expected to have given his place in society, right? And he says explicitly 97% of his attraction to Trump had nothing to do with Kanye's detailed positions on optimal tariff policy or immigration controls, right? It's about energy. He says this explicitly.
Dragon energy.
It's about seeing someone else who did something everybody else said was impossible. He says that explicitly. And Kanye's methodology is if he receives blowback is he doubles down on it. He just doubles down on it. I thought there was a chance when he ran for president, there's a certain transgressive, subversive energy that he had to blur a lot of these kind of neat political strictures that were, this is 2020. This is November 2020, which you know very well because you wrote the best book about it, in which he was completely suffocating in terms of what people were allowed to say about hot button racial topics and other political topics. And here you have this guy who's worth several $1 billion, has infinite cultural clout, and was willing to, maybe in a mentally ill way, like just destroy all the rules that were bounding discourse in the heat of 2020. His political positions since then have taken a unfortunate trajectory, right? They've taken it's gone into places that even the most hardcore fan has a difficult time defending. What do you make of the idea that there ever was a pocket in which he could kind of rupture a lot of these? He was a uniquely powerful force in rupturing a lot of these rules that had constrained conversations about race, particularly in 2020, or is Camille right? And that was all just me projecting onto him, and that given the nature of his internal neurochemical makeup, it's always been mental illness, and we're just seeing that now with Heil Hitler and him making diamond-encrusted swastikas.
I don't think he ever could have been like a viable political option. I think that I've been fascinated with him for decades. I mean, he's a really interesting figure. I mean, I think he's made some of the best music of, popular music of my lifetime. Fascinating when he had that kind of disinhibition to just blurt out the thing he said about Bush during Katrina. I think that actually it was really wrong. But it was powerful. I mean, when Bush left office, I don't know if you remember this, but it always struck me that when he left office, after all the damage that happened in his wake, he was asked, like, is there anything that you regret?
Yeah.
And it wasn't like Abu Ghraib or
terror, invasion of Iraq under false pretenses.
It was like, Kanye West called me a rachist, and I'm not a racist.
I remember he said that.
And he's like, and I'm mad. And you could tell he was really upset about it. It was so Kanye had this ability to break through.
He speaks mimically, like he speaks in virality, and that was in 2004 before there was enough technological infrastructure to make it super viral. But he was always that way.
So that's
Trump talks that way too. That's why they like each other.
Yeah, and what always struck me about when Kanye was saying, they said, well, what makes you think you're president? He said, I'm so inspired by Trump because Obama never showed me, I don't care that he was the first black president. He never showed me that I could be president, but Trump showed me that a celebrity could be president. And that's the real identity category I belong to. That's the real barrier. It was such a strange.
It's dope though.
It's dope.
Guys, dope though. That's all right.
But that alone shows you that there's a kind of limit to, to his capacity to unify and bring people together.
Right.
There's not a big enough constituency of celebrities
Right.
to be for that to be the identity category that's the most meaningful for him. But I think I'm with Camille on this. That it's really sad to see somebody dealing with that kind of mental health problem in public and with the pressures of fame. And I think it's kind of sad just to see how he tries to be so transgressive and people don't even really care. I mean, he says stuff that you wouldn't believe if someone told you 5-10 years ago that somebody would make a song called Heil Hitler, or that he would be saying the kind of things he's saying, that he would, be getting a blowjob in public in Venice and stuff like that. And you kind of just shrug because you can't take seriously that he's even transgressive in a way that matters, And that's sad for that to have happened to such a kind of interesting and original artist.
Yeah, genius.
Yeah.
I think he basically is kind of depressive and thought that fame and fortune would solve it. It didn't. He found it to be empty, like many other people who are smart and self-reflective after they get fame and fortune will say out loud, it doesn't do to you what you think it'll do to you.
Right.
In combination with losing access to his children.
And his mom dying. I mean,
his mom dying and him being in a vacuum, in a void, the hyper-isolation of celebrity.
And marrying a Kardashian. I mean, that's like the black man's curse. They almost killed Lamar Odom.
Kim's underrated. You can't speak ill of her. I don't think she's the reason why that didn't work out. And then the decision to try to numb some of that psychic pain with nitrous oxide is probably suboptimal. And I think there's a deep well of sadness in him. And then he just got around a couple suspect people that put on top of that sadness a plausible story that is just Jews and Ari Emanuel.
Candace Owens.
That's the reason why you're so sad, and he just runs with it. But I don't think that it's driven from a place of deep. I'm still skeptical it's driven from a place of deep conviction, but I don't know.
I really don't know. I mean, that type of kind of edgelordy trolling and anti-Semitic kind of riffing is so strange to me. I really can't see where it's coming from. It's kind of sad to see someone crave attention so badly that they just spew out just unbelievable, gross stuff like that, and the whole world just kind of shrugs. And it's just you've ruined your reputation for not even. I mean, not even. He's not even a racist leader. I mean, he's just kind of a sad, pathetic guy.
I think what's happened is a malfunctioning of some of his core programming, though. But think about it if you're like him, which is you're a kid from you're a professor's son. You're kind of a mama's boy. You spent a year in China in 7th grade. Your mom would not let you take the subway in Chicago because she thought it was too dangerous. You're slightly autistic and you have adult braces and you try to break into the rap game. And the first time you rap in front of Jay-Z, he laughs in your face.
I know, that's amazing. The documentary was amazing too.
So the first thing that he wants to do, everybody says you're crazy. And through pure genius and grit, he proves them wrong.
Force of will, yeah.
Right? Same thing happens with fashion.
Yeah, I remember when they couldn't get into the shows in Paris.
He gets blackballed in the high-end fashion shows. He leaves a pretty lucrative deal with Nike because they won't give him enough control. He goes to Adidas, and he makes $1 billion fashion brand, right? So that's the second time. He was told this is what reality is, and just through pure Kanye genius, he proves them wrong. That happened also with Dark Twisted Fantasy. I think He said that explicitly. People just said, you just embarrassed yourself in front of America's sweetheart. Your career is over.
He went to Hawaii and recorded that
and made
album.
One of the 10 best albums of all time. Yeah. So this is multiple times where everyone's saying what you're doing is crazy, and by doubling down, he's able to just break the simulation. Sure. And I think there's some malfunction where then everyone says when you say the Jews should hug Hitler, you're being crazy. He's doing the same thing he did before, which is double down, and just it hasn't generated the same results. That's my semi-apology for him.
That's the same problem on some level with Elon Musk and all these people who have had massive success. It becomes very difficult for them to believe that they're not infallible on some level.
Right.
And I think that's the risk everybody has. And social media can make that kind of experience more accessible to people that are orders of magnitude less famous. But you, in your micro fame, you can start to opine on things that you really don't have any reason opining.
Have you felt that pressure?
Yeah, I think Twitter, there's a kind of meme that's like last week we were, experts on Ukraine. This week we're all epidemiologists.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Next week we're going to solve Israel-Palestine. And there's a danger in that, I think that, it's very difficult to stay in one's lane. It's more difficult with success to stay in your lane than with failure, for sure.